The arbitrator had not even finished reading the opening statement when my mother-in-law turned to the room and announced, loudly and without a trace of hesitation, that I had always been a leech. Not a gold digger, not an opportunist, a leech. She used that exact word, holding it in her mouth like she'd been saving it for months, which she probably had. Her attorney, a thin man named Graves, who had the energy of someone perpetually disappointed in the weather, didn't even flinch. My brother-in-law sat beside her, arms folded, wearing the expression of a man who had already mentally divided the furniture. He glanced at me once, then looked away. The way you look away from something you've already decided doesn't matter. I folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. The conference room on the 14th floor of Aldrich and Pierce was wood-paneled and smelled faintly of old paper and expensive coffee nobody was drinking. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago spread out gray and enormous in the February cold. 8 months. That was how long it had been since Thomas died. 8 months since the funeral where my mother-in-law had stood at the gravesite and looked through me like I was glass. 8 months since the will had been read privately and quietly, and she had discovered that her son had left everything, the house in Evanston, the brokerage accounts, the personal effects to his wife, to me. And so here we were. Before I tell you what happened in that room, before I tell you what the arbitrator found in the folder that made my brother-in-law's attorney stand up and immediately ask for a recess, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I'd love to know who's part of this community. I had met Thomas's family for the first time at a birthday dinner for his father, a man named Gerald, who had the warm handshake of someone who actually liked people. Gerald had liked me. His wife, my mother-in-law, had looked at me across the dinner table like I was a stain on the tablecloth she was deciding whether to mention. I was 26. I was 2 years into building my financial consulting practice, living in a one-bedroom in Wicker Park, driving a car that needed the passenger window manually held up on the highway. She had asked me, politely, what I did. I had told her. She had nodded the way people nod when they are not listening, and turned to ask her son if he was eating enough. After Thomas and I married, it got quieter, but not better. My mother-in-law was the kind of woman who expressed disapproval through omission. She would talk around me at holidays, speak to Thomas about things she could have asked me directly, remember details about every other person in the room, and forget mine. She forgot my birthday, 3 years running. She remembered my sister-in-law's dog's birthday. I stopped mentioning it. What she never forgot, what she seemed to hold on to like a piece of furniture she refused to let go of, was her certainty that I had married her son for what he had, which was, by any honest measure, not that much when we got married. Thomas was brilliant and funny, and he loved me in the particular way of someone who had never been fully seen before, and was overwhelmed by the experience. But he was also 3 years out of a failed startup and working his way back up inside his family's small commercial real estate brokerage. He was not rich when I married him. He was on his way. It was a detail she never seemed to absorb. Thomas's family business, Whitmore Property Group, had been founded by his grandfather, and was currently being held together by his brother Derek, and the administrative assistant, who had been there since 1987, and did most of the actual work. My mother-in-law was technically the chair, a title she wore like a crown and exercised like a hobby. The business had been struggling quietly for years. I knew because Thomas had told me, and then because I had looked at the numbers myself, and the numbers were not good. But I did not say any of that in the conference room. I sat and listened while Graves walked through the legal challenge point by point. Undue influence, cognitive decline, a wife who had isolated her husband from his family in the final years of his illness, a woman who had, according to Graves, systematically inserted herself into Thomas's financial life in a way that left him no meaningful independence. My brother-in-law nodded along, a performance of reluctant agreement, the expression of a man doing something distasteful out of necessity. My mother-in-law stared at her hands. My attorney, a woman named Reyes who was 44 and had the kind of focused stillness that made opposing counsel visibly nervous, did not object to any of it. She had told me before we walked in that morning, let them put everything on the table first. Every card, every accusation. Let the room fill up with their certainty. Then we opened the folder. I looked out the window at the gray February sky and let my mind drift back to the Tuesday 18 months before Thomas died, when I had understood, finally, what the business was actually worth, which was to say, almost nothing. The brokerage had 3 major commercial tenants keeping it solvent, and 2 of those leases were expiring within 18 months, and Derek had not secured renewals. The operating account had less than $40,000 in it. There was a bank line of credit at a rate so punishing it suggested the bank had not expected it to be repaid. Gerald's medical expenses over the last 2 years of his life had quietly drained most of the family's personal liquidity, and my mother-in-law, who managed the household accounts, did not appear to have noticed, or had noticed and chosen not to look directly at it. Thomas knew it was bad. He didn't know how bad. I did not tell him everything I had found. He was sick by then, the diagnosis already confirmed, and the last thing he needed was to spend whatever good time he had left worrying about his brother's balance sheet. So I did what I always did when I saw a problem with a clear solution and a person I loved standing in the blast radius. I moved quietly, and I moved early. I opened Harlow Capital 4 months before Thomas's first hospitalization, a financial holding company, registered in Illinois, with a registered agent address in the West Loop and a name that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been told what it was. Through Harlow, I approached Whitmore Property Group's bank directly and offered to purchase the outstanding line of credit at par. The bank accepted within 48 hours. They had been trying to figure out how to offload the account for 6 months. Then I extended the company a restructured facility, lower rate, longer term, clean covenants. Not a gift, a loan. A proper senior secured loan with proper documentation. The kind that gets filed with the Secretary of State and recorded in the public register and is absolutely findable by anyone who cares to look, which the Whitmore family had not, apparently, done. I also, through a separate LLC, purchased the building that housed the Whitmore Property Group's main office when it came up quietly in a distressed portfolio sale the following spring. I had been watching the building for 2 years. It was a good building, solid bones, undervalued by an absentee landlord who cared more about the liquidity event than the asset. I paid a fair price. I hired a good property manager. I raised the occupancy rate in 12 months by 22%. My mother-in-law signed the new office lease the following September, without appearing to read the name of the new landlord on the cover page. It was a company called Meridian Property Partners. I had named it that because Thomas once told me, early in our relationship, that he thought the word meridian was the most underused word in the English language. I had filed the paperwork on what would have been his birthday. None of this came up at dinner. I didn't bring it up. It wasn't relevant to anything at the time. It was a financial position, not a conversation. But now I was sitting in a conference room while my mother-in-law's attorney described me as a calculating woman who had isolated my dying husband and positioned herself to inherit what wasn't hers. And I was thinking about the fact that the building we were currently sitting in was also mine. I had purchased the Aldrich and Pierce building as part of a commercial portfolio acquisition the previous spring. 14 floors of prime loop real estate, fully occupied, 3-year leases across the board. My property manager handled the day-to-day. I collected the rents. I looked down at the conference table. The grain was nice. I liked the building. It was a good investment. Graves finished his opening and sat down. My mother-in-law smoothed her jacket. Derek was already looking at his phone under the table. Reyes waited 1 beat. 2. Then she opened her folder. She didn't stand up. She didn't raise her voice. She simply slid the first document across the table toward the arbitrator, a retired federal judge named Holloway, who had the patient expression of someone who had heard every version of every story and was waiting to hear what was different about this one. "I'd like to enter into the record," Reyes said, "the current loan agreement between Whitmore Property Group and Harlow Capital, along with the corresponding UCC-1 financing statement filed with the Illinois Secretary of State." Holloway accepted the document. Graves looked at it. His expression didn't change, but his stillness did a subtle recalibration. A man quietly updating a spreadsheet in his head. Derek looked up from his phone. Reyes slid a second document. The deed of record for the building currently housing Whitmore Property Group's main offices, registered to Meridian Property Partners, LLC. And a third document. The Articles of Organization for Meridian Property Partners, listing the sole managing member. Holloway reviewed each one in turn. My mother-in-law leaned over to Graves and said something in a low voice. Graves put a hand on the table in a gesture that was almost a response. For the first time since we had sat down that morning, Derek looked directly at me. I looked back. "Harlow Capital," Holloway said. Not a question. His eyes moving through the financing statement. Reyes nodded. "My client is the sole member of Harlow Capital. She is also the managing member of Meridian Property Partners. She has been the senior secured lender to Whitmore Property Group for approximately 31 months, and the building's landlord for 22 months. My mother-in-law turned to look at me then. Not with the blank dismissal of earlier in the morning. Something different had moved into her expression, not quite recognition. Not yet. More like the particular disorientation of someone who has confidently taken a step and found the floor further down than expected. "That's impossible," Derek said. He said it the same way people say something is impossible when they mean they don't want it to be possible, which is a different thing entirely. "There's a simple explanation," Graves said, recovering his professional composure. His voice was still measured. "This appears to be an attempt to create the appearance of financial leverage after the fact. We'll need to verify the filing dates on all of these documents. If these were filed after Mr. Whitmore's death, they were filed before my husband was diagnosed," Reyes said. She placed the date-stamped Secretary of State records on top of the pile. Every document in this exhibit set carries a state filing date. The earliest is 31 months ago. Mr. Whitmore's diagnosis was 27 months ago. Silence. It was a different kind of silence from what had filled the room before. The earlier silence had been the comfortable silence of people who believe they already know how a story ends. This was the silence of recalculation. My mother-in-law's voice, when it came, was quieter than I had ever heard it. She was a woman who used volume the way other people used punctuation, which meant that when she went quiet, something had changed structurally. "She's the landlord. she said to Graves, as if testing the words. Of the main office. Yes, Graves confirmed. His tone had shifted into something carefully neutral. And the lender. Graves nodded fractionally. She sat back. The room waited. I thought about Easter Sunday 2 years ago. The last Easter Thomas had been well enough to travel to his mother's house in Evanston. We had driven up together, Thomas in good spirits, me with a bottle of wine I had carefully selected because my mother-in-law had once mentioned offhandedly that she liked a particular kind of burgundy. I had found a bottle. A good one. I brought it to her in the kitchen, and she had looked at it briefly and set it on the counter, and said that was very sweet, and turned back to the stove. She had served a different wine at dinner. I had eaten and smiled and said nothing, and afterward, in the car, Thomas had taken my hand and said he was sorry. I had told him not to be. It wasn't his fault. What I hadn't told him was that I had already that morning signed the paperwork, extending Whitmore Property Group's credit facility for another 18 months, at a rate that would keep the company alive through what I already suspected was going to be a difficult year for commercial real estate in the Chicago metro. I had done it because it was what he would have wanted, and because he was already getting the first headaches, and because some things are more important than being acknowledged. Derek had gotten himself together. I could see it happening. The way you can watch someone physically square their shoulders against something. He leaned forward across the table. Even if everything in this exhibit is legitimate, he said, the senior secured position doesn't change the estate claim. Thomas's will still needs to be probated. The undue influence allegation is separate from whatever business relationship existed between my sister-in-law and the company. You're conflating two separate legal issues. Graves put a hand on Derek's arm, a restraining gesture. Derek shrugged it off. She kept this from Thomas, Derek continued, his voice gaining confidence. She was building a financial position against his family's company while he was sick, without telling him. That's exactly the kind of manipulation we're describing. That proves our case, not hers. I looked at the window. Reyes opened a second folder. Thomas Whitmore signed an amendment to the Harlow Capital Loan Agreement 14 months ago, she said. She placed the signature page on top of the pile. It's co-signed by an independent attorney, witnessed by a notary, and the amendment was drafted by outside counsel retained specifically for that transaction. The signatory's legal capacity was confirmed by a capacity assessment conducted the same day, which we have also included. Mr. Whitmore was fully informed of the nature of the lending relationship, including the identity of the lender. He signed it voluntarily. Derek stared at the signature page. He knew, Reyes said, very quietly. My mother-in-law made a sound that wasn't quite a word. 14 months ago was 3 months before Thomas died. He had been having better days by then. A brief window where the medication was working well, and he was himself again, in a way that felt like a loan you knew would have to be repaid. He had asked me about Harlow one evening in February, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, going through some papers I had thought were unrelated. He had looked up and said, "Is this yours?" And I had said yes, and he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "You've been holding them up the whole time, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. I had said something like, it was just a business position. It made financial sense. He had put down the coffee and taken both of my hands across the table, and he had looked at me for a long time without saying anything, and then he had said, I need to add something to the amendment. He had asked me to include a default provision. His idea, not mine. He dictated the specific language to the outside attorney over the phone while I sat in the other room pretending to read. The provision stated that in the event of any legal proceeding brought against Harlow Capital or its principals by any officer, director, or family member of Whitmore Property Group, the loan would immediately accelerate to full maturity, and all collateral positions would be enforceable without further notice. He was smarter than I ever told him he was. Or maybe he just knew his family. Reyes placed the amendment on the table in front of Holloway. She turned to the last page and pointed to the default provision. Paragraph 9, she said. Section F. Graves read it. He read it a second time. He set the paper down. My mother-in-law, he said, slowly. I need to speak with you and your son privately before we continue. My mother-in-law was not looking at the paper. She was looking at me. Not with hostility anymore. Not with the particular contempt she had calibrated over the years we had known each other. She was looking at me with something I did not have a clean name for. It might have been recognition. It might have been something closer to grief, not grief for Thomas, which she had carried visibly and loudly since the funeral. But a different kind. The grief of someone who has spent years building a story about another person, and is only now understanding, in a quiet room with cold coffee, that the story was wrong from the beginning. I did not look away. I let her look. This proceeding is a legal action against my client, Reyes said, her voice matter of fact. Filing it triggered the acceleration clause as of 9:47 this morning, when the proceedings were formally opened by the arbitrator. The full loan balance, $214,000, is now due and payable. Additionally, the default provision in the commercial lease agreement for the Whitmore main office's Meridian Property Partners, paragraph 11, contains a cross-default clause tied to the Harlow loan. The company is now in default on its lease as well. Derek stood up. You can't do this, he said. His voice had lost its careful lawyerly calm and become something rawer. He looked at me the way he had looked at me from across every holiday table for 10 years, with the conviction that I did not fully belong in the rooms I was standing in. You did this on purpose. You set us up. You've been planning this since Thomas died. Since before he died, I said. It was the first time I had spoken since we sat down. Graves put a hand on Derek's shoulder. Derek shook it off again. You built a financial trap and then you waited for us to walk into it, Derek said. That's not grief. That's revenge. I looked at him. No, I said. I looked away, back at the window, at the gray February sky over the city. What I built was a business. What you walked into was a legal proceeding that you chose to file, with your name on it, against my husband's estate. I didn't file it. You did. Derek sat down. Holloway set down the amendment. He looked at Graves. Given the acceleration clause, he said, it appears the nature of this proceeding has changed materially. Counsel, I'd suggest that recess. Graves was already gathering his papers. During the recess, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at the lake, which was gray and enormous and completely indifferent to everything happening in the room behind me. My mother-in-law walked past me on her way to the door and stopped. She stopped so close I could smell her perfume, the same one she had worn at our wedding, the same one Thomas had given her every Christmas. She stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, her voice low and not quite steady, that she had not known. About Harlow. About any of it. I know, I said. You were keeping the company alive, she said. I turned to look at her. She was 71 years old and she had lost her husband and her son in 18 months, and she was standing at a window in February with her composure balanced on something very thin. I am not a cruel person. Whatever I am not that. I was keeping Thomas's family out of a bankruptcy he didn't need to worry about while he was sick, I said. That's all I was doing. Her eyes went bright for a moment. Not with anger. She nodded once, very slightly. Then she walked through the door to where Graves and Derek were waiting. The proceeding resumed 40 minutes later. Graves announced that the plaintiffs were withdrawing their challenge to the will. In a separate statement, read aloud by Graves with the flat, careful delivery of a man who had been handed language he did not write. Whitmore Property Group acknowledged the default status of the Harlow Capital loan and the cross-default under the Meridian Property Partners lease, and requested a structured workout agreement in lieu of immediate enforcement. The statement noted that the company wished to explore a repayment schedule that would allow continued operations. Holloway noted the withdrawal. He looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at me. I had written the workout terms myself, at my kitchen table, 2 weeks before the proceeding, because I had always known it would end here, and I had wanted to be ready. The terms were fair, not generous. Fair. Full loan repayment over 36 months at the original restructured rate. Lease continuation at market rate with a 2-year renewal option. Personal guarantee from the company's officers, Derek, and my mother-in-law in her capacity as chair, because that was what the loan documents required, and because Thomas had dictated that provision too. Quietly, in the same February phone call. Reyes presented the workout agreement. Graves reviewed it. He conferred with his clients. He came back and said they would accept. Derek signed it without looking at me. My mother-in-law signed it last. She held the pen for a moment after, not writing anything, just holding it. Then she set it down and gathered her things. As she stood to leave, she looked at me one more time. I thought she might say something. She opened her mouth and then closed it. She nodded instead, the same small contained nod as before. Then she left. I sat at the table until the room emptied out. Reyes packed up her files and squeezed my arm on her way out and said she would call me tomorrow. I stayed another few minutes, looking at the conference table. The grain of the wood was maple, I thought, or possibly cherry. I would have to ask the property manager. I collected my coat and my bag and I pressed the button for the elevator and I rode down 14 floors and walked out through the lobby and into the February cold. I did not feel victorious. I had learned, in the year since Thomas died, that there is a particular kind of outcome that looks like winning from the outside and feels, up close, mostly like relief. The relief of a situation that had been suspended and unresolved for too long, finally landing somewhere solid. A weight you had been carrying so long you had stopped noticing it setting down. I walked 2 blocks to the parking garage and sat in my car for a while without starting it. I thought about Thomas at the kitchen table in February, his hands around the coffee mug, the way he had looked at me when he asked, "Is this yours?" The way he had held my hands across the table after. He had known before that day, I think. Not the specifics, not Harlow, not Meridian, not the UCC filings, but he had known the way you know things about someone you have been paying close enough attention to. That I moved quietly and early, that I solved problems before they became emergencies, that the way I showed love was often invisible because it happened in spreadsheets and signed documents and transactions that no one would ever see unless they looked. He had looked. I deleted the 2-year-old voice message I had been saving from his phone. Not blocked it, not archived it, deleted it. I had been keeping it the way you keep something you are not ready to let go of. And then one day you are ready, and the readiness arrives quietly, the way most real things do. I drove home through the gray February city, past the lake and the bare trees in Lincoln Park and the coffee shop where Thomas and I had gone every Sunday for 4 years, past the parking garage, where he had proposed to me in the rain because we had been running late for a dinner reservation, and he had decided, apparently, that a parking garage was a perfectly good place. I had told him he was ridiculous. He had said he didn't want to wait any longer. I had said yes. At home I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where he used to sit, and I looked out the window at the street. The Harlow Capital accounts were still open. The Meridian portfolio was still performing. The commercial real estate market in Chicago was showing early signs of a recovery that, if it continued, would look very good for a patient investor in approximately 18 months. I had built all of it in rooms where no one was watching, in the early morning before Thomas was awake, and in the late evenings after he had gone to sleep, in the quiet hours when the only sound was the radiator and the distant traffic. I had built it because I was good at building things and because I love someone best through the work of making sure the things they love are safe. It was never about the money. The money was just the instrument. The real thing, the thing I had been working toward without quite naming it. From the first evening I had looked at Whitmore's balance sheet and seen what was coming was this: the ability to sit at my own kitchen table, in my own apartment, in a city I had chosen, and feel the particular solidness of ground that holds because you laid it yourself. Some things, you have to build before anyone sees you building them. Some people only believe in what they can see. The coffee was good. Outside, the first snow of the afternoon was starting. I watched it come down over the street, quiet and unhurried, covering everything evenly, the way weather has always been wonderfully indifferent to the human dramas happening beneath it. I thought I would call my sister. I thought I would take a walk later if the snow was still light. I thought that for the first time in a long time, I did not have anything left to prepare for. The weight that had been sitting on the kitchen table between me and everything else for 2 years was gone. Not because I had won something, because I had finally finished building what I had set out to build. And it had held. I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and let the warmth come through. Outside, the snow kept coming down.